Remembrance Day and Remembrance Week, of course, being marked very differently this year because of COVID, the impossibility or difficulty of gathering together. But it does not mean that we can't stop and remember, look back, and look forward. It is true that history is a bit of a minefield these days, but I think it's important that we understand it. Tim Cook is a historian at the Canadian War Museum. He's authored dozens and dozens and dozens of articles, but also 13 books. And his most recent one is The Fight for History, because this year marks the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And his book is about 75 years of forgetting, then remembering, and then remaking our story of Canada's Second World War. So, Tim, thank you for coming back and being with us again and looking at a more, I guess, the time since then. And we talked in our last conversation about when we moved from the sense of being warriors to the sense of being peacekeepers, and why people thought that we couldn't do both, or that you can't keep the peace if you can't make the peace, and you need warriors to do that. One thing that has always so troubled me in this country, and it's because I've had a chance to travel and live elsewhere, is that we hide our military away from the general populations. You'd be hard-pressed to find a military base and therefore exposure to people in uniform, to know them, their wives and husbands, to know their children. Was it deliberate?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for being back on your show. Was it deliberate? Well, I suppose it was. It was a policy during the Cold War to group our Canadian Forces members on various bases, which then tended to remove them from our broader society. And so part of that was a cost-saving measure, and part of that was a better ability to train. And so there are operational reasons. But what it ultimately did was to remove many people in uniform from our broad cities. And so that it seemed like we almost had no Army, Air Force, or Navy, even though usually we've had between 60 and 100,000 members as DND, and most of them in uniform. So it diluted some of that, and it also created, I think, in the families. And I've been lucky at the War Museum, where I'm a historian, as you've mentioned. I've been able to speak to veterans, those who served in the Canadian Forces, those who continue to serve, their families, occasionally their children, that they too have been a group unto themselves. And there is, as you know, you've spoken to so many in your life, there is a culture there, just as there is a soldier's culture that is not easy for people to understand, but it's a culture, I think, of survival. It's a culture of identity. It's a culture that can be difficult for others to break into, because it really is a fairly small band of Canadians.
The question of, and I've had people tell me this, not only regular soldiers, but people that work at D&D, National Defense Headquarters, that they were actually instructed at different times, and I'm thinking of Mogadishu and other periods like that, where they were instructed to wear civilian clothes to work and change into uniforms once in the building. That's, to me, is just horrifying.
Yeah, I've heard the same stories. I've been told by veterans. That happened certainly in the 1990s, I think, when really traditional Pearsonian peacekeeping died. And it died in the killing fields of Rwanda and in the former Yugoslavia, as it broke apart into ethnic violence, and in Somalia. And that really was a dark period. You know, if we look at Canadian military history, the members of the Canadian Forces, there were scandals. There was really just a starvation wage paid to our service members, some of whom had to deliver pizza, to just simply put food on the table for their families. And so it was a dark period. And, I think things have improved with our Canadian forces. And yet there is still a very strong sense in Canada, I think, that we are a nation of peacekeepers, that, as I've always said, and I said on your previous program, I'm very proud of the role that Canada has played in bringing peace and hope to parts of the world. And yet we're not just a nation of peacekeepers. That's actually for quite a limited time in our history, basically the second half of the 20th century. I think, as I said in your previous show, we fought 6 wars in the 20th century, the South African War, the Great War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Cold War, the Kosovo bombing campaign in 1999. Before that, the Gulf War in 1990. So that's a lot of war for a country that sees itself as a nation of peace.
I had the extraordinary opportunity, and I will put it that way, to travel to Afghanistan on 4 different occasions, part of the 5-person Manly panel to go over and try and assess what our role should be. And to watch it develop over time was great. We recommended airlift, and the government of the day responded and did do that. But when we arrived there the first time, I've got to say, our soldiers were in fatigues that not desert fatigues. I mean, jungle fatigues, the wrong color. We were in tanks that couldn't, or vehicles that couldn't have withstood a set of birthday candles, never mind, IEDs in the road, and the road was littered with them. We were lucky enough at one point to be airlifted out of a FOB, a forward operating base, because 2 young guys who'd gone down the road before us had their legs blown off. I mean, honestly, I was embarrassed, and as a Canadian, that we had asked people to serve and to risk their lives, and to do so without even the most basic of equipment to accomplish their mission, and B, save their own lives.
Yeah, it's a historic theme, in fact, that you can trace throughout the 20th century and even earlier, where we never put much money into our military. We chose other things. Those are decisions that various governments have made over time. But if we think of in the First World War, where Canada entered that war grossly under-equipped and using things like the Ross rifle, which didn't work on the battlefield and jammed, without proper artillery or machine guns. And the same thing happened in 1939, where despite the fact of everybody seeing war coming with Hitler and the Nazis and the fascists, that Canada was again grossly unprepared for war, even though Canadians enlisted in tremendous numbers. And we can track that, that in times of war, and we talked about this on your previous discussion, we can create an incredible industrialization and industrial mobilization. But it takes time, and we have often let our military rust out, is a phrase that has been used. And certainly the low point most people point to is that period in the 1990s where there was just very little for the Canadian forces. And of course, with 9/11 and then Canadians in Afghanistan from late 2001, Special Forces, and then early 2002, as you said, many of them ill-equipped with all manner of just basic material and equipment that they needed, absolutely needed.
Such an extraordinary group of people. I remember sitting there one day, this was on a separate trip, but General Stanley McChrystal came in. John Vance, now the Chief of the Defense Staff, was leading operations there, and we were sitting having a long conversation, and 2 things struck me is that he was not a man who would blow smoke, as it were. He really was saying, we need you, because the kinds of things you can do, especially in these counterinsurgency operations, is that you travel in much smaller groups, and you can go into smaller towns and villages and communicate with people, and Americans have to have complete force protection every time they move. So we are a very valuable ally. In that sense.
Canadian forces have always been regarded as among the best. And this goes back to the Great War, where Canadians were seen as the northern the Northern Dominion soldiers who had been, and the Canadian soldiers like to play this up, been raised in igloos and born with a rifle in their hand and fighting polar bears. And of course, the British, they loved this, right? They saw that these hardy Canadians, but they were hardy. Mm-hmm. They were, they had grown up hard, and facing a Canadian winter in Saskatchewan is not an easy thing then or now. And in the Second World War, the same feeling that the Canadians were very good and hardy, and that we had that our fighting formations, either 1st Canadian Army or the Royal Canadian Navy or Bomber Command 6th Group, really played a key role. And that would continue in Korea and our peacekeeping reputation. And as you've said, in Afghanistan, where Canadian service personnel are highly trained. And often, as you know, we are engaged in training roles for other forces because we are so adept. And so there is a reputation there among the Canadian forces that you can track over, well, even to the South African War. Mm-hmm. And so that's something.
Well, even today, people will say they'll always take a farm boy or a farm kid because they know how to fix stuff in the middle of the night when the machine breaks. So they actually have that skill set.
Yeah. One of the great things, challenging things that always struck me about the Canadian forces in Afghanistan was their ability, and this must go to their incredible training, to be both combatants, to be warriors in the field, but also to be diplomats. Mm-hmm. To sit down and to talk and also to defend our civilians who were there, those who were involved in development programs. And I always thought, personal opinion, but having read a lot of military history and having written a lot, we ask a tremendous amount of those in those unconventional war zones. Mm-hmm. The challenge of moving from war fighting to diplomacy to force protection to building a school, to helping a water supply, to laying a road. And it's not always the Canadian forces, but they always have to be there, or those other things simply can't happen.
That I actually witnessed myself again out on at a forward operating base where our troops had been out for 2 or 3 days on a mission. They had accomplished their mission. We do not know what the mission is because, of course, they didn't discuss that. But they came back to base, to camp, and before they slept, before they ate, before they had a shower, they went out and rebuilt a school that the Taliban had taken down. That was just, we're not going to let those SOBs, win this one. We're going to get that school up for tomorrow morning for the kids. And we had the ability to go into those schools and talk to the teachers and the young girls who had bare faces, who to that point had not been allowed to look at strangers or men or foreigners. I had to go into the school by myself and leave the other 4 guys out for the first trip. They did that without being ordered to, but because they felt they should, and it was part of their mission and part of their job.
Yeah, and at the Canadian War Museum, where I'm very lucky to work, as you've mentioned, we have a new section on the Afghanistan mm-hmm. War. In fact, from post-1991, I suppose, and the end of the Cold War, which my colleague, Dr. Andrew Birch, has curated, and just a very powerful exhibition of the artifacts and the stories of Canadians who have passed through those rotations. And we think of the 40,000 or so Canadians who served there. That's an incredible number. And just when I was speaking recently about my new book, The Fight for History, it was in a Zoom context like this. And I miss speaking and seeing people. But this gentleman, he reached out to me and he said, I'm an Afghanistan veteran, but I'm 55 years old. And he said, when we think of veterans, he was in an early rotation, 2003 or 4, and he was old by soldier standards at that point. But he said, now we have Afghanistan veterans who are 45, 50, 55, maybe older. And we talked about the veterans experience, which is one that is deeply interested to me. I've always wanted to know, how have we treated our veterans? How have we helped to reintegrate them back into society? With our two world wars, these wars that involved our total societies, where the 620,000 who served in the Great War, the 1.1 million in the Second War, they were citizen soldiers. They came from our communities. And so how did we help them reintegrate? And what happened to members of the Canadian Forces and with Afghanistan now? And we have had successes and we've had failures.
Let's talk about that, because we too there had a lot of reserve participants as well. Teachers, people who had left their assignments as teachers or firefighters and had gone over, and of course the RCMP were there. I think we pay a much greater lip service now to the question of dealing with veterans, and we have programs and it's integrated. But we also see the Veterans Affairs Minister post treated like a revolving door. It's kind of low on the rung in terms of who is important. People go there for training purposes or on their way out the door. And it, by that, we kind of send a message that it's not always that important.
Yeah, I mean, as a historian, I'm always interested to use the past to help ground us in the present, and, and those incredible stories. And one of the things that struck me in writing 13 books and curating a dozen exhibitions and other aspects of history is, what is the debt? What is the debt that we owe our veterans? And that changes from society to society, from time period to time period, from generation to generation. And after the Great War, we didn't do a good job in integrating our veterans back. They were flung back into society. There were very few jobs. The country was in tremendous turmoil in 1919 with strikes and unrest and fear of communist uprisings and organized labor fighting for their well-deserved rights. After the Second World War in 1945, we did a better job with the Veterans Charter. We understood the importance of bringing veterans into society. And so there's two interesting contrasts of the debt. And I think we have done a better job, but by all historical accounts and by speaking to veterans, there was not much support for members of the Canadian Forces who left during the Cold War and even the early part of the 21st century. It took Afghanistan and the growing awareness among Canadians, brought to light by very fine reporting, I think, of the epidemic of suicide as it was labeled, and the deep emotional and invisible wounds that soldiers carry. And that's not unique to Afghanistan veterans. Of course, it's for all of our Canadians who have served in times of war. It doesn't mean every veteran carries invisible wounds, but we know that enough have. And so what is the debt? Well, there is a debt to care for people physically, emotionally, and mentally. I think most Canadians would agree to that. How that is done is a tremendous challenge for governments of the day. But there is a second debt, and that debt, as we have seen with Remembrance Day, is one of remembrance and commemoration, and to ensure that the stories are not forgotten, stories of service and sacrifice, stories of young men who have been cut down and who never got to return home. And I think that's a question I think that we as Canadians must grapple with. There are no easy answers, but in the end, what is the debt?
That's such an important question. And we went to a field hospital there, and I went to hospitals when I returned back to actually see the visual evidence of those that survive, but not always intact. And it is brutal. And I think that we need to be aware of both those levels of debt, as you say. I think we're starting to understand in a slightly better way also the difficulty of, we call it transition to civilian life, but as one veteran pointed out to me, it's not transition back to civilian life. We were never there. We signed up when we were 17 or 18, or we were kids. So we're going back into civilian life for the first time, or going into civilian life, and they don't know what to do. They've been told what to wear. They've been told what time to get up. They've been told where they're going to live and where they're going to move and how they're going to serve. And then all of a sudden we say, okay, you're on your own. So we really need to work on that part.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we have a much better sense. And Senator, I think there's a tremendous resiliency I have found among members of the Canadian Forces and ability to adapt and the constant moving. And it's in all aspects of their life. And I do think we have a better sense now. I have a friend, Joel Watson, who's involved in important organizations that help to retrain and to remind Canadians that veterans have just brilliant skills that they bring, very different skills. And, to return to history, since I'm a historian, we did that successfully after the Second World War. That's the model. In fact, the government of the day passed the Veterans Charter, as it's called, a series of legislation that retrained and offered loans to veterans and encouraged them to study at university. And that propelled us forward into the wealthy half of the 20th century. There's other factors, of course, but taking care of veterans and helping them reintegrate is good for your economy. If you want to be brutal about it, if you don't care about the debt, well, it's simply what you need in the Second World War case. You want those million veterans to return to jobs, which they did, and they built up our country.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just think that there is a practical nature here, putting aside the question of the debt and how we should repay through remembrance or what have you, that there is an obligation as well, many people would agree, to ensure a transition that makes sense.
The two things go hand in hand, because what I witnessed in the United States when I lived there is that because the general public embraces the military, because they have more experience and exposure to it and with it, there is a willing embrace by corporate or working America to understand what these men and women do and say, if you can run an operation in Afghanistan, you can probably run a department at, an auto manufacturer or even an insurance company, but certainly in the world of security. That movement between the two worlds is a lot more fluid. And I think we need to learn from that. If we're not exposed to them, we don't actually understand what their skill sets are beyond going to war and shooting guns when necessary.
Yeah, I have to agree. And I think that the difference probably in the two societies is just the number of, as you would agree, right, of Americans who have served in really their two forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how that has permeated their entire society. And interestingly, in Canada, up until about 2008, in survey polls, more than half of Canadians thought that Canadians were involved in a peacekeeping operation in Afghanistan. There was just not a great understanding of what our Canadian Forces personnel were doing there. I think that's changed. I think we have a better sense, and yet there's still a great ambivalence to, if we think of that war or even others, that there is something about Canada that we talked about in the previous podcast about how we see ourselves. And, I'm a military historian, and yet I don't think that we are a militarized nation by any means.
No, exactly.
We define ourselves in many ways, and I'm through healthcare or through our different regions or our different languages or questions of indigeneity or what have you. There are many ways to think of ourselves, and that has changed over time. And I do think, however, as I've written about in my new book, The Fight for History, that the great silence that surrounded the Second World War for so long, we broke that. And yet it took a long time, and it's an ongoing challenge, I think, to know who we are as a people.
I'm just curious about your own work for a moment, Tim. You don't come from that military family that crisscrossed this country and living in 52 different towns and cities. A family member, one in the military. What drew you to this?
Yeah, I had a grandfather who served in Bomber Command during the Second World War. He was from Alberta, Gordon Cook, and grew up in the Depression, Lethbridge, and very, very little future. And he joined the RAF as a Canadian and served all 6 years. And so that's always been something that has interested me. But I think I didn't grow up in a family of Canadian Forces or anything like that. My parents were both accomplished historians. So, of course, Senator, when I went to university, Trent University, I wanted to do anything but that. Unfortunately,
it's in the genes, apparently.
Yeah, I majored in rugby my first 2 years. So I found that history was something. Tremendous professors who excited in me the stories of the past through the people. And I've always approached the history through those eyewitnesses, first through the poetry and the prose of the Great War, and then later through letters and diaries, and then understanding how war has shaped our country. And I went to the Royal Military College of Canada. I did my master's there. I went as a civilian, but I learned an awful lot. And I think, it was a tremendous learning experience for me. And what I caught a glimpse of, I think, is that culture, the culture of those who have served. And I remember being at RMC and seeing the cadets who worked very hard. I mean, they were tremendous in their studies, but then they would do their physical fitness and they would do drill. In the summertime, they were off training at Gagetown or some other place. And I thought, this is quite remarkable. And it comes back a bit to what you were saying of how most of us are not exposed to members of those who serve unless you're in a particular part of the country where there's a base or a large unit. And that opened up my eyes. And I've been very lucky, as you've mentioned. I worked at the National Archives and then at the Canadian War Museum from 2001, where I was involved in creating the First World War Gallery. And I guess my underlying motivation has been to tell our stories. I see myself as a public historian. I have a PhD in history, but I'm really interested. I'm interested in all Canadians knowing their history. And the story I tell is I used to play hockey, and I would be in a dressing room, and someone would say, "Oh, we saw you on TV last night. You looked good," because it was history television from 9 years ago.
Yes, I was younger then.
That's right. I always looked great at 26. So, but I got a sense that these were guys who were plumbers and business guys who probably wouldn't pick up a history book, but they wanted their history through television or a podcast. Not back then, but the many ways that we can tell our stories through a museum. And I believe that's important for us to create the opportunities for Canadians, elderly, whatever age, young people, to learn about our history. It's important. And I'm not suggesting it needs to be, and it shouldn't be, just heroic history, right? Mm-hmm. I don't want us to stand behind the flag.
No, we can tell the real stories. Yeah.
We need to tell the real stories, warts and all, and yet it should not just be the warts. And we are in a period now where, for a number of societal reasons, we have been drawn to the stories of oppression, dark stories of hurt, and they are there in the past, as they are in every country. And I think it's important for us to talk about those and to work through them. And yet, there are also times, and I'll just speak to military history, if we think of the Second World War, 1.1 million Canadians coming together to serve in the forces. That's 1 in 10 Canadians. Another 3 million who served in wartime industry. English Canadians, French Canadians, new Canadians, Indigenous Canadians coming together to do something hard and to pay the price. 45,000 Canadians killed, and yet we did it. And that's a story that I think we need to know as Canadians.
I want to ask you this from your point of view as a historian and somebody who lives in the world of the new technology. I know you've said that history can be dangerous. Governments are often afraid of it. It stirs passions up. It has become a minefield where the statues of heroes are being torn down. I think it's hard to know how to tell these stories and deal with all the political correctness or wokeness or whatever you want to call it that permeates today, and our ability to have these conversations. But the importance, contrast that with the importance, as you say, of understanding where we came from, because it is who we are.
Yeah, I think you've said it nicely there. Conversations, we must have them. We can't shut down each other. We can't silence each other. We can't cancel our history. We need to address, on the same hand, we need to address the past and the hurt and the pain when it's there. But as I've already said, that doesn't mean that those are the only stories we should tell. And I think that itself is wrong and not historically minded. Now, you're speaking to someone who spent 25 years writing about our history. I'm biased here. I believe it's important to tell these stories. I want us to know the past. And as I have often felt, if we don't tell the stories, no one else will. And so let us engage in these conversations, but respectfully and even with passion, but to understand that it probably does little good to simply cancel out things that we find offensive today for people in the past who lived 50, 100, or 150 years ago. We need to remember that they lived in a different time, in a different society. They had different education. They didn't live through the rights revolution like we have from the 1980s. We are fundamentally different as Canadians, and in fact, in most of the Western world, because of the rights revolution. And part of the job of being a historian, part of what I try to do is to situate the historical characters that I write about in the past, to explain to my readers why they felt that way. And it can be from all kinds of things, from education, the region they came from, the prejudices of the time, which were many, deep and full, and often that would shock us. And yet they were living their lives. And we need to understand that. When we condemn the past by the standards of the present, we're not doing anything related to history. It may be something else. And I understand if certain people or groups carry deep grievances and hurt and pain, and that they are doing that for something to make it right in their own mind. That's a different thing than engaging in history, as I see it.
It's just been so wonderful to speak with you about this and get inside your head. Because you've got it all there, and we're so grateful that you are telling our story, particularly the military history of this country. So the most recent book, but any of them, I'm telling you, The Fight for History, 75 Years of Forgetting, Remembering, and Remaking Canada's Second World War. And the show, the production you've got at the museum now, which will be there. Hopefully people will be able to come to Ottawa again and do that. So we really thank you so much for your time and your willingness to share this.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Tim. We've all got to remember always that we today live in the land of the free because of the brave. Thanks for being with us on this special Remembrance Day week edition of No Nonsense.